Welcome to Education by Design, the podcast that explores how schools are shaping the future of education by centering on values, embracing community voices, and building systems that work for every student. I'm your host, Phil Evans. So far, we've talked a lot about how important it is for students to see themselves as lifelong learners, not just as passive recipients of information. So in this episode, we're going to explore exactly how to create an environment that nurtures that kind of learning, one where students are not just taught, but they learn how to learn for themselves. I'm really excited to have Trevor MacKenzie to talk to us about his work in inquiry-based teaching and learning. Because when it boils down to it, an inquiry-centered education isn't just a nice to have, it's really essential. It's what drives students forward in their own learning. In fact, Trevor shares in our conversation that he had a really eye-opening experience in a parent workshop where three fathers approached him with a question that really made him think.
I do a lot of parent workshops. I'm thinking of one in particular at a pretty darn prestigious international school. There were about 150 parents came to a workshop. And the intention of the workshop was to talk about different assessment models that we're using at the school and different teaching approaches, i.e. inquiry and curiosity. And that's a pretty amazing turnout. Like 150 parents coming to talk about assessment and teaching and learning. That's usually they get like 20 or 30. And it wasn't because I was in town. It was because we were talking about assessment. It was that really got parents in the door. Now, what was fascinating, Phil, is in the workshop, I baked in all these turn-in talks, all these collaborative structures so they could experience what their children are experiencing in classrooms, right? And at one such moment where they're engaged in some kind of equitable talk structure, I had three fathers come up to me, just approach me in the midst of the workshop. And they said, Trevor, you're really good at what you do. You're a bit of an entrepreneurial teacher, aren't you? And I said, I am. Yeah, I am really good at what I do. Thank you for noticing that. And the one father said, where did you learn those skills? Did you learn them in school? And I said, absolutely not. I learned them on the fly. I learned them in the field. I'm kind of self-taught. I'm a curious guy. I figured them out. And then I turned the tables on them. I said, what do you do for work? Each of them own a business. Each of them were either a CEO or some kind of business owner. And I asked them the same question. I said, where did you learn the skills to become what you are today? Did you learn them in school? And they said, no, we learned them on the fly. And they each said, we wish we would have learned more of what we know now in schooling back then. And that is the shift in that paradigm, right? We want parents to see that we're doing things differently because we want kids to see the point of school. And I bet if we ask teachers parents to rewind to their schooling experience, a lot of them would say, it didn't really set me up for the successes that I have today. I had to learn through experience. I had to learn that in the field, in the work. We want to accelerate some of that for our students so they could be future ready, so they can leave school with more of a skill set, you call it agile learners, to have them face a myriad of challenges, problems, scenarios with empathy, compassion, and expertise, if you will.
I thought it would be really worthwhile to share this story up front because it's something that we really need to pay attention to. Students who excel in traditional compliance-oriented education systems, the students that check all the boxes, they're still underserved. As I was listening to Trevor, I was thinking about those fathers being really quite goal-oriented students themselves when they were in school. But perhaps they weren't engaged in a deep learning experience, the type that an inquiry-centered education can offer. So I asked Trevor if he would just break down, what does an inquiry classroom look like?
I'll share three simple things that I see teachers do really beautifully in classrooms of curiosity. Number one, and this is like a little bit of a no-brainer, but forgive me, it's often overlooked, is just being transparent about the intention. Meaning the intention of today's activity or this experience is we want to get you full of wonderment. And it's amazing when we set that intention or when we're that transparent, you see more kids who are curious. Like they start to do that move where they put their finger on their chin and they start to wonder about things. It's fascinating just how transparency matters. All too often the teacher's doing all the thinking and the planning in the classroom, and we're just not transparent enough for our students. So transparency is a big one. The second one, as I mentioned, provocation. So before we get into question routines, a critical move is provoking our students towards the curriculum. How do we show them the relevance? How do we get them questioning different aspects of the curriculum? So a key provocation, a powerful provocation, it's a critical move. And an outcome of provocation should be what we call student-generated questions. Like if they're curious about the curriculum, they should have some questions about the curriculum. And this is where question routines really come into play. I have 10 high-impact question routines that allow students to sort and organize their questions and even justify their questions in order for us to use them to plan next steps. And so when we think about the values of the inquiry classroom, things like agency, the thinking is done by the students and not just done by the teacher. Collaboration, students sharing multiple perspectives and kind of having their ideas bounce off other people. Question routines really are a blanket around all those things that we value.
But that's what we're trying to nurture in the classroom.
Yeah.
That's what the inquiry mindset is all about. It's actually what kicked you off on this journey that's taking you on to all these different exploratory adventures and successes.
Yeah.
That's what we want for kids to experience in their daily schooling. I was going to ask you an obvious question. Why is inquiry so important, being central in the classroom? But I was thinking maybe I'll rephrase it to say, why isn't an inquiry mindset such a central part of teaching practice?
Yeah, and there's so much research that talks about what we want for kids we need as adults. Like you can't stifle teachers. You can't not provide agency or independence or meaning for teachers, but then expect them to give it to students. There's a beautiful kind of weaving of fabric there that needs to happen in schools, and schools of curiosity and schools of agency, teachers that experience curiosity. There's an amazing kind of transfer of that in terms of the experiences our children and our youth have in the classroom. So absolutely, couldn't agree more.
I want to come back to a lot of the different strategies that you've mentioned in passing here, but before we do, have you worked with schools where behavior issues and disengagement has been a paramount challenge for the school community? And have you seen an inquiry mindset and a shift towards a more engaged learning experience mitigate those behavioral issues? Can you talk to us a little bit about those sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. We have, over the years, curiosity is really hard to measure, Phil. Like, how do I tell that you're curious right now? The surest clue to curiosity is to ask the person, how curious are, like they'll tell you on a scale of 1 to 10 how curious they are. So what we do is we survey kids in schools that I support on a scale of 1 to 10. How curious were you in your studies? And we can even narrow it down to subjects, right? High school kids, how curious were you in math compared to social studies compared to English? We should see some really nice opportunities to pick apart where we're doing some good work and where we have yet to do some of the work towards curiosity. When kids self-assess high on this curiosity scale, like 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, there's some amazing correlating data that everyone listening will be able to predict. Academic achievement increases when kids are more curious. When they see the purpose of learning, they do better in those classrooms. Attendance improves. So kids, especially at the high school level, they come more often and they come in a more timely manner. Behavioral reports are fewer in classrooms of high curiosity. So admin are seeing less kids sent to the office when the learning in the room is relevant, authentic, when they see the point, when they're interested in the learning. High school, it really shows up in terms of not just behavior, it turns up in attendance. They vote with their feet, right? At the younger years, they vote with their feet, but in a different way. They misbehave when it's not interesting. They're kicking, or they're running, or they're standing up out of their seats. They're literally walking to something else in the classroom that is interesting, quite literally. Sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's the playground. So your mention of behavior, absolutely. Like, I don't want to propose that curiosity is the antidote, but it has a huge impact on so many different areas in schooling that we care about. I do want students to do well in school. Academic achievement is really important. So is belonging, so is being a part of something, so is being a part of a community. So that's another piece. When kids score high on the curiosity scale, they say things like, I like my teacher likes me, I have friends in that classroom, right? So there's a sense of belonging in spaces of curiosity as well, Phil.
It's like reflection in real time for the kids in that sense. They're sitting there and they're looking at the work and they're being afforded that opportunity to reflect on what has happened in their learning experience in a way that if you just sort of stamp it, grade it, write on it, send it home, it probably gets lost at the bottom of the book bag or the back of the locker and cleaned up at the end of the year, doesn't it?
Yeah, if I could be provocative for a minute, Phil, and maybe get a little pokey, forgive me, but what's easier? Is it easier to provide transactionary experiences, or is it easier to create the conditions for curiosity? One could easily argue that the latter is much more challenging, right? Like to engage 20, 25 young people in igniting their curiosity, having conversations with them about how the curriculum is this place for learning to come alive. It's much easier to have this kind of one size fits all model. And so again, the transparency in the work, routines and frameworks that allow teachers to do just that, ignite curiosity in the classroom. I think that's a big reason why my work has been so well received. And again, teachers that want to teach from an inquiry stance may not just know those routines yet. They may not know how to invigorate and spark the curiosity in the classroom. So not to get too pokey, but I think it's easier to teach transactions, than it is the curiosity stance, isn't it?
I think so, because I mean, that's the industrial model, isn't it? Mass production, mass education, it's still much easier to measure on a multiple choice test than it is to assign a project and to grade those projects and use rubrics and give students formative feedback so that they can leverage that for their next exercise.
Yeah. And that's a very passive experience, right? Like so passive. I'm doing all the heavy lifting if I'm stamping it and grading it and then and then the child puts it in their backpack, never to be seen again. And parents are like, well, what's the learning? A, B, C, or D, right? It's a much more heavy lift for us to sit with students, have those rich conversations, and then have them be in the driver's seat in a much more meaningful way. And so when I say heavy lift, what do we need? We need some clear structures so teachers can see this is what a 2-minute conversation might look like. Oh, this is what an 8-minute conversation might look like. So again, what are those boxes, to demystify the work? I think it's really important that we identify some of those for listeners, but also for teachers out there who want to add to their repertoire. They can almost do a self-assessment of their own. Okay, Trevor said co-design. Like, what do I currently do to co-design? Or Trevor said conferencing. What do I currently do? It's a strength-based reflection, right? What do I currently do? What might I do next? But it's important that we add to that skill set that allows us to teach from an inquiry stance.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about those, because I love that you tipped a little bit into this when you're saying, the first step is for a teacher to kind of demonstrate that curiosity and show how contagious that can be of what are the things that you're interested in. But that, I think, is where the question competence comes in, and the routines. Like, the routines are something that when you have a routine, do you really think about every single stroke of brushing your teeth? No, you're used to. Like, if you've really practiced brushing your teeth well, that comes second nature to you, and you go about those morning, routines very quickly to get yourself ready to do the things and go where you want to go. And I think that's the beauty here when it comes to the routines that you talk about in the book. And, I love that you preface all of this with, we know some of the theory, but the theory isn't enough. So how do we move into the practicality of all of this?
One is co-designing. Like, teachers who teach from an inquiry stance have a number of co-designing repertoire or structures in their toolkit, right? They build the learning together. They co-plan with students. They facilitate experiences where all students have a voice in creating the parameters of learning, right? And co-designing is its own little box of strategies. Curiosity as an outcome. If we want curious kids, we need to engage in provocation, right? We need to provoke curiosity. We need to have the curriculum come to life. Conferencing is another one, like conferencing structures where you're sitting with children and students and talking about their learning and giving formative feedback and guiding them towards next steps, and even better, having them see their next steps and determine what's best for their learning. So we see some younger years teachers, of the primary years, for example, they'll spiral, they'll cycle through that little process maybe several times within a single less than a half an hour. You may see them cycle through, right? Because the children are just so insatiably curious about their their play or about their social time or about the learning. So at the younger years, you see teachers just spiral back and forth through provocation, student-generated questions, a question routine. Whereas in the middle years or upper years, a teacher may just condense that learning or that experience across a single block. So we see these routines falling in a variety of contexts and really kind of morph into the context depending on the needs of the curriculum, the teacher, and the students, if you will.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about provocations, because I think that's awesome. I always love to kind of present, it's almost like the problem or the question. Talk to us about some of the like hard examples of some great provocations in classrooms.
Yeah, I love compelling statements, those thoughtful big questions where students have to take a stance. Those are fantastic. They can be thematic, they can be problem-based, they can be opinion-based. I love those. So we can kind of chunk those under compelling statements, compelling questions. I love art and images as provocations. So photography, artwork, videos can be really, really rich provocation. I love place as provocation, Phil, like getting your students outside the walls of the classroom, whether it's into nature or just doing a learning walk around the school. It's amazing, math teachers, when we do a geometry unit or a measurement unit and we give students an iPad to go take photographs of geometry around the school. It's amazing what students find. It's amazing where their eyes go. There's geometry and measurement and shape all around us, and having students identify it and then come back and talk about it, and then using those as provocation to apply our mathematical learning towards those kind of artifacts that students are finding. So place is provocation, whether it's nature or just going for a walk around your school. I love a simulation. Like some teachers do simulations beautifully, whether it's a scenario that you're painting or whether it's something that students are actually acting and behaving through, where students are kind of putting themselves into someone else's shoes. And in that perspective shift is stimulating curiosity and questions. And then when they zoom out of that experience and talk about the learning more broadly, again, we've got some rich questions that we can leverage. And I love speakers as provocation, like, an expert in a field or a guest speaker. Sometimes it's a relative who knows something about what we're learning about, and can we zoom them in? Can we invite them in? There's a fantastic list of samples of provocation in my publication. And then there's also a reflection tool, a bit of a rubric for teachers to use to determine if their provocation is going to fly or if it's going to flop. And this is where question routines really come into play. I have 10 high impact question routines that allow students to sort and organize their questions and even justify their questions in order for us to use them to plan next steps. And so when we think about the values of the inquiry classroom, things like agency, the thinking is done by the students and not just done by the teacher. Collaboration, students sharing multiple perspectives and kind of having their ideas bounce off other people. Question routines really are a blanket around all those things that we value.
Well, to kind of put some of these things together, it's like I remember when I first took a photography class, just looking through the lens of the camera, I started to look at the world around me differently. I mean, I had to go and take a photograph of a rusty car, like that's been sort of dumped out the back of the river. When you were talking about the geometry in the world around us, it's just that reminded me of that kind of interdisciplinary approach that this takes, and it's what you can't unsee. I remember when we were teaching visual literacy in ELA in Australia, I just thought it's so amazing that we're talking about vectors and salience with seventh graders, and that we're helping them to think about, that, a non-response is a response. Like if you're standing at the bus stop and there's a billboard or a poster next to you and you decide not to read it, it's not because you see it. So, to me, I feel like, that this approach to learning, an approach to teaching is something that helps students to get on their own feet with their learning in a way that just goes well beyond the classroom. So we're talking about being deliberate about going outside the classroom and bringing people into the classroom and those sorts of things. But I think what we're actually stirring in the student is the ability to to see themselves as learners and constantly be thinking and processing in their daily lives.
Yeah, something you said to me that really stood out was once you see it, you can't unsee it. Right. And that's a beautiful reality in the inquiry classroom, is that, Oftentimes teachers plan for transfer, an interdisciplinary unit, you're going to be doing some mathy stuff and some sciencey stuff and some Englishy stuff. And the teacher is the vehicle for transferring, the teacher's launching the transfer. The reality is in the inquiry classroom, the student is the vehicle for transfer. Like they are making connections to other subject areas. They are making connections to their lives outside of school. It starts to kind of, again, the fabric is more tightly woven. There's not this difference between what I'm learning in this subject and this subject and this subject. So questioning is a key ingredient as well. If we were to have a box, question routines would be another one of those boxes of strategies that we want teachers to utilize in order to have more authentic inquiry experiences happening in classrooms.
So can you tell us a little bit about the 10, right? So why 10? And what do the 10 represent?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I'm not the first person to engage in something like these structures. There are some amazing routines or questioning frameworks that I've discovered over my years. I think of, for example, the question formulation technique by Dan Rothstein and Lou Santana. It's a fantastic questioning structure. And what I wanted was more structures. As we know, students become pretty accustomed. They get used to the type of learning pretty easily. And the aim was really to have an array, several routines that teachers can select and choose from. And there's no vertical alignment to the routines. There's not like a scaffolding, like you must start with this one and this one is the pinnacle. It really is a body of work that allows teachers to think really critically about their curriculum, their objectives for their students, and what routine could support both of those. So some of the routines call on students to sort according to types of questions, whether it's closed questions and open questions. Some call on them to order their questions in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. So what's the type of thinking that the question is taking us towards? Some of the routines call on students to sort their questions, the different question stems, how questions, why questions, what questions, etc. The beauty of the routines is it really shows how all questions have a purpose in learning, right? Like how we need to explore some close if we want to understand and explore the depth of the open. Whereas sometimes I think that teachers and students feel like the close-ended stuff is too superficial or it's too easily found on a phone. Whereas we really want to show students that there is, again, a bit of a breadcrumb trail to these questions, and it actually leads to more rich learning, more beneficial research. So every routine allows the teacher to be a partner in learning. I think that's a key facet here. It takes us away from the front of the room and allows us to be in the learning with students, and in doing so, allow us to follow their lead to a certain degree, which I think is a really key shift in the inquiry classroom, is how are you more of a partner in learning?
It's about, like, do you see yourself as a learner? And I feel like, when you've done workshops from, you've been all around the world talking to all these different teachers in different educational contexts. What are some of the themes that you see in terms of the challenge that the initial challenges for teachers to make a shift in their practice from what they've always done to trying something a little new?
Yeah, well, I think just really clearly identifying what some of these structures are. I do a lot of co-teaching, Phil. And so I think that's such a nice way to move the needle, as you say, is to be in a classroom and co-teach with teachers and have other teachers watch that lesson. There are ways we can build capacity. We record a lot of those lessons and we edit them down into these little documentaries of the lesson. We see teachers say, I never would have thought that student would have asked so many questions. He never asks questions, right? Or I never thought this student would be so engaged. He was fully hooked in the whole lesson, right? So when you hear those observations, those noticings, those returns on investment, not only do you know the structures are helping, you're seeing a shift in the mindset. Like if we want greater engagement, here are some strategies. If we want more thinking in the room, here are some strategies. So teachers need to see those strategies in action in order to, of course, see that ROI. And that's not hyperbole. Time and time again, we see students self-regulate in ways that they can't self-regulate in other types of learning, where they're in a seat or where they're working in isolation, they're working independently. When there's that social aspect to the learning, all these other beautiful things happen. So co-teaching would be a model that I love to engage in, But again, it's showing the teachers the strategies, the routines, and action is a huge one. That being said, you mentioned something earlier about wanting our students to see themselves as learners, right? Like an outcome of the IB is we want students to be lifelong learners. And I would add to that, we want them to see themselves as being capable, as being competent, as being, in charge of their outcomes. Like they can control their surroundings. And there's nothing more dehumanizing than feeling like you don't have control over your surroundings, that it's not possible for you. You can't do it. So in the assessment realm, having assessment strategies and routines that allow not just for self-belief, not just for efficacy, not just for agency, but a deep understanding of what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And all too often schools are built around, this is where you're at, this is your number, this is your grade, and they're not wrapped around reflection. They're not wrapped around conferencing. They're not wrapped around rich self-assessment so that we can see lifelong learners. So adding to that statement that you shared earlier, Phil, we want kids to see themselves as capable, and adjacent to that will come confident. Like they'll be confident learners if they see themselves as being capable learners.
And there's something to be said for the messages that they get from the adults. I hear from students, I was told that this is where I belong, or I was told that I shouldn't put my, foot forward in this direction because, yes, I am intelligent, yes, I am smart, but that's probably going to be a little bit out of your zone. I think that the system has actually conditioned the adults to think this way about what students are capable of.
Yeah, you're scratching at some really important stuff, Phil. So first of all, you said it, when leaders say something about the North Star, about the point of school, about the reason we're all in this place together. And if the North Star is something about lifelong learners, if it's something about agency or independence or student ownership, if that is the North Star, then we can go places, right? But sometimes I walk into schools and that's not the North Star. Sadly, it is about achievement, or it is about what parents want for their children in terms of academic achievement and grades and scholarships and acceptance letters, right? So having leaders really clearly define or collaboratively build the North Star, what is the vision, why are we here? That's imperative. That's number one. Number two, as I said, you're scratching at something really important. It's the parent conversation. Like many students come to school and they want certain things. And the reality is they're coming to school with a ton of baggage that isn't theirs. They're coming to school with demands placed on them or pressures placed on them from parents, from an educational paradigm that we're trying to dismantle.
I mean, even to say that we're trying to dismantle it, we're not even trying to do that maliciously. It's just not even a relevant model anymore.
Well said. Yes.
Because learning agility is one of the most important things in today's world. Like, we're shifting into new ways of being human alongside the augmented tools that we have to process so quickly, And I think we're just not setting students up to success if we think it's about this piece of paper getting me into that next thing and getting that piece of paper in order to... These tickets are no longer a passport for success.
No, you've hit it. So you phrased it as being learning agility. And so if we were to crack that phrase open, in that phrase are like a handful of skills, of competencies that allow people to be agile learners. Like curiosity would be a disposition in there, critical thinking, collaboration. Like there's a series of competencies and dispositions within being an agile learner. And you can't flex those skills in a classroom if we're doing that transactionary learning. If I'm just handing something out, if I'm lecturing and students are just busily doing tasks, there's no flexing of skills apart from the demand of the specific task, whether it's writing or analyzing or doing a mathematical equation. We need to teach differently. There need to be different teaching experiences and learning experiences if one is to become an agile learner. Hence why inquiry is an approach to teaching. If we teach from an inquiry stance, those approaches to learning are more likely to be robust and be fruitfully kind of flexed by our students. So that's a key piece, Phil, is why isn't this happening, or why is the old model an old model? It's because it's not serving the citizens and the people to be agile learners. So you hit it on the head. I think we just need to crack that one open. And what does that look like? And then how do we teach for those dispositions and have the content and the tasks be a part of it, but not be the driving force of it, if you will.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to be telling new stories, because the old stories are still like very much at the center of our culture in school. It's just ironic, I think, that we're going to be compliance based, and if I do well, and I've been conditioned to do well, and I've also maybe been set up and privileged in my, context to do well. When does that kind of forward thinking happen for an adult if their entire schooling has been based on transactions like that, But I think that when you put something in its place to replace it, it's not as daunting and as challenging. I love the example that you've given of the parents that literally, unsolicited came to you and said, we see something going on here and we want to kind of understand what we think it is. Every student, is capable of asking these questions and pursuing these areas of interest. And it's that kind of, well, at the beginning of this conversation, we said it's easier to gravitate back to those traditional industrial shapes of mass one-to-many in education. It's harder to do something that's, but I would beg to differ that, when we actually step back and we say, well, we didn't actually reach those CEOs in our midst, right? We failed the CEOs as well as failing the kids that couldn't pass the test. We failed everybody. So, maybe if we shifted the approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I just want to share some ingredients of lessons where we get that higher engagement and we get more student competence, because you painted a beautiful picture. Students of diverse learning needs, students who are pretty atypical, who are pretty capable in every setting and scenario, students whose first language isn't English, perhaps. We have a lot of different students in the classroom. Some moves we need to make, some ingredients. Number one, physical movement. Like when students get out of their seats and on their feet and they have agency over their bodies, they're self-regulating. There are all those beautiful skills and competencies tend to bubble up more fluidly and freely because they're in their bodies. Whereas if they're in their seats, well, number one, they're squirrely, right? They're going to have a tough time being still. But number two, those skills aren't coming up in a seat. They're just not naturally coming up. You need to engage in some physical movement in the class. And I'm not talking about a brain break, like going for a walk. All of the question routines invite students to get on their feet to some kind of vertical surface and sorting and organizing. Once that's done, once the evidence of thinking and learning is visible, now we have what we call a universal support. So this is another ingredient. Universal supports are access points that all students could, grab and use, rather than differentiating for one student who is an English language learner or a diverse learner. What we're doing is we're providing universal supports that we've somewhat co-designed with the children, with the students, and we're just making them visible. If we were to do a provocation, for example, Phil, I'm going to ask students to notice and name what they're seeing, what they're experiencing in the provocation. I'm going to scribe that. I'm going to write those noticings. And then I've got this really rich word bank. I've got some vocabulary that all students can use in their questioning. So their questioning is inherently going to be more robust, more detailed. More students are going to be able to ask more beautiful questions because of that vocabulary from the provocation. So when we talk about, it's not hyperbole, we see high engagement, every student in, there are some ingredients that allow that to happen. It's just not a routine. The routine calls on physical activity, competencies to be flexed, and then these universal supports to be visible and accessible for all students, not just one. And when those universal supports are there, Phil, the teacher in the room can go and support students much more robustly. Like I may have more independent students in the room because they're using the universal supports.
I love that the inquiry mindset in the classroom is just so grounded in the relationship between the teachers and the learners in the classroom. But I'd like to shift the conversation to talk a little bit about AI and the changing climate in education. I see AI as a bit of a companion for curiosity. What do you think?
Yeah, well said. Companion for curiosity. I think I want to hear more about that, Phil. So hold that thought. I don't think AI is going to replace people, right? There's a human element to the world and to teaching and learning. There are these asides, there are these conversations, there are these questions. And then there's triangulation. Like, just because AI has given you something, how do you know it to be true? Like, we need to unpack that. We need to talk about it. And then there's just such great benefit in terms of research, in terms of asking AI questions. I've seen some amazing classrooms create AI characters from things that we're reading, things that we're studying. So it's almost like you have an expert that you could talk to, that you can ask questions to, and then you get that information. And what do? You triangulate it with other sources. And now you're getting critical in examining what the AI is giving you and what's out there in the world, perhaps already pre-AI or around AI. I'm seeing some schools do amazing things with feedback. I just co-taught a lesson in Shanghai, Phil, where we had 5 feedback stations around the room. And one feedback station was an AI generated feedback station. Students will sit, give AI their draft of a piece of writing, get some feedback, and then they were prompted with some sentence stems to turn and talk to a peer about the feedback that AI gave it to, again, triangulate. And that was just one station was AI, and we had 5 different stations that students were rotating through, each designed to create a more thoughtful, reflective writing experience. So in terms of an asset, absolutely. In terms of a replacement, absolutely not. When you said, a companion for curiosity, Phil, what were your thoughts there?
Well, I'm thinking about question competency, because it's all about how you create a really dynamic prompt with all of the information that it could possibly need, and that the question that you're asking has, qualifying boundaries. It's almost like we get to code without understanding how to actually code in the computer world. The biggest fear that teachers have had is that students are going to cheat with AI. And I'm like, well, how are you teaching if they're going to cheat with AI? Where's the process in the learning that's visible to all of us? It's conscious for the student and visible to the teacher. Like, what kind of engagement are these students in? If you're just assigning a paper and then they're going to do it on their own and give it back to you, chances are anyone could. Like, that's what science fair used to be about, right?
What do we want students to do? We want students to do the heavy lifting so they can be independent learners. How are we drawing the curtain back on those prompts, those questions that are useful? Question routines help that process. Like, if you do a question routine through the lens of what might we ask AI, you're going to come up with much more fruitful questions than just giving your students AI and throwing them in the deep end. So I see teachers doing this beautifully, front-loading AI with parameters and questions, and then students can access it. But all you're doing is putting a fence around the AI for your students. We want your students to build that fence alongside you. So questioning is a key piece. When you said a companion of curiosity, I thought of, we need to build up the question competence, the prompt competence, and how do we do that? Question routines are a huge, huge piece of that puzzle.
Last question, all right? One question that you hope every teacher asks themselves after listening to this podcast.
Ooh, that's a good one. And it's a question, see how quickly it came to me? Like, as soon as you asked it, I knew the question I was going to share. It's a question I actually ask myself like a dozen times a day in teaching. It's, am I doing something for my students that they should be doing for themselves? And I ask myself that question a dozen times a day because it really puts me in the stance of, who's doing the heavy lifting here? Who's doing the thinking here? Who's doing the learning here? And can I back away a little bit and create the conditions for the students to do more of that? Readily, time and time again, the answer is emphatically, yes, I can. And there are things that we do for kids that they could easily be doing the heavy lifting on their own. So, as a question broadly, that would be one that I would hope all teachers sit in often in their classroom, in their practice, in their teaching.
You've been listening to the Education by Design podcast. I've been your host, Phil Evans. If you like this episode, please hit subscribe or follow, and join me for my next episode. And until next time, keep on learning.